everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me today, and thank you for inviting me a year ago when I ended up in the hospital and couldn't be here. And Nelson, thank you for promoting me. Glenn is the senior minister. I'm the executive minister. I think my boss would want me to make that clarification. So I am head of all of the business activities of the church, and we have 3,500 members, so that's quite a lot to do. So that sermon in 2010, I told a story that actually occurred in December of 2001, which was 3 months after 9/11. My son at the time was 10 years old and a hockey player. And we had a game at 6 a.m. at the fairgrounds. All hockey players go to games at 6 a.m. in the morning when it's cold and dark. I don't know why that is. Somebody must be playing hockey at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but it was never my son. So we go to the fairgrounds, and when we went into the parking lot, it was, of course, deserted because it was 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was actually 5 o'clock in the morning. And but when we came out just a couple of hours later, the parking lot was jammed. And I mean, packed. And there were people coming from all directions toward one of the conference buildings on the fairgrounds, and they all appeared to be Muslim, and in fact they were. The women, many of them were covering their heads, and they had their children with them. And I'm going to be honest with you, 3 months after 9/11, this was at first a little unsettling. And I'm not proud to say that at all, but it was. I was a little bit afraid. And I was also afraid of running over somebody because it was just packed with thousands of people, and we were trying to get out of the parking lot. And after a minute, I could pick up anxiety from my son also, who, as I said, was 10. And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, wait a minute. This is the celebration of Eid. This is the celebration of the end of Ramadan. And these are all folks coming for a religious practice of celebrating the end of Ramadan. And that completely shifted it for me. It also reminded me that I was not at church that Sunday morning, but was at a hockey game. But all these other folks were involved in a religious practice. And that completely shifted the feeling and the story for me. What was even more interesting about all of that is 10 years later, a Muslim man from Dublin who had seen my sermon on Facebook emailed me, and he said, I was in that same group of people that day. I was with my family coming to celebrate Eid, and I was also afraid, because it was the first time that the Muslim community had gathered in a large group since 9/11, and we were afraid that we might be targets that day also. So we were both dealing with our feelings of anxiety and fear and trying to move beyond them. And that's our task today as well, not only for this community, but for all of the world. A few years ago, there was a Navy SEAL who died in battle. And his wife did an interview on network television the next day and said, my husband was a warrior for his country, and he was a warrior for Christ. Now, those words come pretty much straight out of the words of Paul in the Second Testament of the Bible, often called the New Testament. But just imagine for a minute if that woman had said, my husband was a warrior for his country and a warrior for Allah. We would have responded to it in a completely different way, and yet she was tapping into her faith tradition just as many Muslims may have done. There's a wonderful story about the first Muslim ambassador for the United States. She's a woman named Shirin Tahir Kaheli. She tells a story, this goes back in 1990, about traveling to Alaska to make a speech. And a woman came up to her and said, you know, before today I didn't know any Muslims, and now I know you, and you're a woman, and you're intelligent and kind, and I think I'm okay with Muslims now. And the ambassador said that made it worth the overnight flight to Alaska to make that speech. But it points to something very, very important, that when we see people as a group and we put all sorts of labels on them, our experience is very, very, very different from when we engage with them one-on-one. And it doesn't matter what the faith tradition or the group label is. I'm a minister, I'm a theologian, that is my language and my education. And so I'm not here to proselytize you or impose religion on anyone, it's just the perspective that I come from. My doctoral research was about Muslim-Christian bridge building, and it was based in what's called social identity theory or social contact theory, which was actually founded by a man named Henry Tajfel, who was a Polish Jew who spent time in the concentration camps. Up until that time, psychological theory had been very much focused on the individual. Why does the individual behave the way he or she behaves? And after the whole experience of the Holocaust and the just incredible mind-numbing devastation that happened as part of that event, the focus became, what is it about groups that cause groups to behave in such a way and to label other people? And how does this work? And so there began in the psychological community, beginning with Henry Tajfel, this focus and this look at group identity. And so what makes the other the other? And how do we connect with people who we view to be the other? And there was a remarkable book called American Grace, which did the most complete survey ever on religious groups in the United States. And their conclusion was, when birds of different feathers flock together, they come to know each other better and often to like each other. So what we know about group identity is that our sense of being in gives us confidence and security and a sense of who we are. And the minute we identify as someone as other, we immediately begin to draw conclusions about them. Now, before I go any further on this, I want to ask you what this is. Can anyone tell me what this is? It's not a trick question. It's a fork. That's right. Now, you don't have to do a lot of in-depth analysis to know that. You know this because you have learned patterns and methods of recognizing things. And so because you know this is a fork, you also know that it's used to eat food. You may occasionally use it to open a can or try to screw open something, but for the most part you use it to eat food. This ability to categorize, to identify patterns, is part of living efficiently. We couldn't exist in reality if we had to figure everything out all the time. So this ability to identify categories is very important, but it really works against us when we're talking to people of a different nationality or a different faith or a different part of the country. Maybe they're even from the outskirts of Milwaukee, and you draw all kinds of conclusions and thoughts about who they are and how they live. This work began with a man named Gordon Allport in the 50s during the Civil Rights Movement. He wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice, and I would actually recommend it to you today because he really talks about how separateness leads to more separateness. And just that identification of someone as an in-group and an out-group changes everything. For example, we have a natural tendency to see the positive things in people who are like us, who we identify as being our in-group. And we tend to emphasize or even exaggerate the negative things about the out-group. That's a natural human tendency, and it's up to us to work against that. And in all of this, the role of religion, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Shinto, the list is quite long, Hindu, because of this, religion can be a cause of conflict, and it can also undo conflict. It can also be a force for peace. I don't know how much you know about Islam, so I'm just going to run through a couple of quick facts. Islam has 5 pillars: a testimony of faith. It's one sentence: no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet. Many Muslims pray 5 times a day. Many of them do not. They have a tradition of zakat, which is giving to the needy, which puts them right in a coherent place with the Rotary and your efforts. They fast during the month of Ramadan, and there is an annual pilgrimage to Mecca, which is not required, but is encouraged if you are able. So, you're probably aware of those things. You may not know that Jesus is venerated in the Muslim tradition, as is Abraham, as is Moses, as is Mary. Jesus' mother Mary does not have her own chapter in the Bible, but she does have her own chapter in the Quran. So these figures that are important to us and important to people of the Jewish faith are also important to people in Islam. And very few people are aware of that unless they've done some reading on the subject. Let's talk about the Quran and the Bible. The reason I'm going to do this is because if I had $1 for every time I've heard how violent the Quran is, I could pretty much fund the cure for polio and a million other diseases out there. So let's talk about that. Are there violent passages in the Quran? Yes, there are. Are there violent passages in the Bible? Yes, there are. Are there violent passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Or as the seminaries say now, the First Testament and the Second Testament? Yes, there are. So it's not even, some people try to tell you, some Christians will try to tell you it's exclusive to the Old Testament. It's absolutely not. As a matter of fact, this doesn't come from a biblical scholar, but there's a software engineer named Ted Anderson. He works in New York City, and he developed a word identification software that he used to identify the levels of violence in all 3 of the holy books. Here's what he found. This is text analytics software. I have no clue what that is, but someone here does, I'm sure. These are his words. Killing and destruction are referenced slightly more often in the New Testament than in the Quran, but the Old Testament clearly leads the pack, more than twice that of the Quran in mentions of destruction and killing. That's the Old Testament. Now, if you'd like to look for a good example of that, go to the book of Joshua, which is a very short book, and you'll see there that the great prophet Joshua, it is said in this book about him 8 different times, and the communities were utterly destroyed. What that means is the troops led by Joshua went through communities in conquering the territory and followed the tradition of the time, which was to utterly destroy the community, to kill every last man, woman, and child, to destroy every building, and to destroy every piece of livestock. So, there's a little tidbit for you the next time someone tells you the Quran is the violent book. That requires more investigation and conversation and scholarship because it is simply not true. Another point about looking at the Quran and the Bible and different faith traditions around the world is that we must look at the context of what's being said. The ancient world was very, very violent. For all people, all faiths, all traditions, all places in the world, it was a violent place. And because of that violence, men, young men, and adult men died at an alarming rate. At the same time, women at this time in history had no way to provide for themselves. So it was incumbent upon the men who survived to provide homes for women. That's how you get men with more than one wife. That's how you get, as it says in the Old Testament, that if a brother dies, his brother must impregnate his wife so that she will have children of her own. All of these events are about a culture where there was a shortage of men and where women needed to be part of a male-headed household to survive. The point about that is just to open your eyes when you hear something on the news, when you hear some commentator talking about how horrible the Quran is. My goal is just to give you a little bit more information, solid, balanced information that will let you take that in and understand it in a different way. A lot of that's written in the Quran and the Bible is also a corrective to what came before. So, for example, does everybody know the phrase an eye for an eye? Of course you do. This was a corrective to the idea that if someone did a minor insult to you, you could respond in all kinds of ways that were very disproportionate to what had been done. So Jesus came along and he said, well, if you lose an eye, then the punishment should be commensurate. It should not be disproportionate. Does that make sense? A similar example from Muhammad is you hear a lot of people going around saying, well, the Prophet Muhammad said everybody gets to have 4 wives. That is true. He said everybody gets to have only 4 wives. He put a limitation on it because it was clear to him that large groups of wives was not something that was working in the culture. He also said, and the husband must love each of those wives equally and completely the same. Now, if there's one man in this room who says he's capable of doing that, I'll be very impressed. But the fact is, we love different people differently, right? Even your children, you love them all equally, but you love them differently. So again, both of those things were correctives to what had been done before. The other piece I want you to hear is that, and this is so important, please take this with you to your email the next time you're reading whatever kind of stuff you get. Language is so important, and language has consequences. Whatever you think about the words radical Islam, they do not apply to 1.6 billion people around the world. Those words, whether you want to use them or not, apply to a small group of fanatics. And fanatics are what present the greatest danger to our world. The word Islamist doesn't have anything to do with the religious practice of Islam. It has to do with a political ideology that has been co-opting the tradition of Islam to give it some legitimacy. They are separate. My guess is that most of the people in the KKK would claim Christianity as their faith. We know they do. We see them out protesting. I'm guessing there's not one person in this room who would say that the KKK represents the values, principles, hopes, and dreams of Christianity. However, they co-opt it to make themselves more legitimate. So please make that distinction. When someone talks to you about Islam or Christianity or Judaism, make those distinctions and don't let them co-opt the words of faith to justify something that has nothing to do with the tradition at all. I'm going to tell you a brief story that you may find uncomfortable. Before I graduated with my doctorate, I was interviewed by the Columbus Dispatch. It was a lovely interview. If my grandmother had still been alive, she would put it on her refrigerator. It had a lovely picture, and I was wearing a very special suit, and they talked to me about my research and what I found about better ways to build connections and come to respect each other. And great article, great picture, everybody was happy. This article was posted on an internet website called jihadwatch.org. It was on that website, in the comments about my article, that I read that what I really deserved was to be circumcised. What I really deserved for my research was to be circumcised with a rusty razor blade. Now, I'm thinking those are people who would claim Christianity as their faith. Those were Americans. Those were not Muslims. Those were people who were absolutely vituperative in their language about Muslims and anyone claiming an honorable faith. Now, I know that that's a yucky thing to talk about, but it happened. I lost one night of sleep that night. Number one, I never read the comments now. I did lose a night of sleep. I was very unsettled by all of that, and it creeped me out, frankly. And then I woke up the next morning and I said, well, you know, those people are cowards and they're speaking under the veil of anonymity, and they don't have anything to do with me and my life, and I'm not thinking about them ever again. But before you think that all the fault lies with somebody else, you have got to know that there are forces in this country who just want to stir up anger and hate against the other, whoever the other happens to be. So, I said my title was Heresies of Difference, and I will get through all of them in the next 3 minutes. One of the things we do with other traditions is we compare the best of our tradition to the least life-giving or worst of the other tradition. So we say, I'll say we as Christians, because that's the group that I represent as an ordained clergy, we are the peacemakers, we are the lovers, we are the people who feed the poor, and these guys are nothing but terrorists, which is a completely false perspective. This is what we kind of tend to do. The other heresy of difference is we have an expansive view of ourselves and a very limited view of the other. There was a documentary that I would highly recommend to you called In God's Name. And an imam who was quoted in that documentary said, "All religions are made up of reasonable people and unreasonable people. I pray the reasonable people will outnumber the fools." I pray that the reasonable people will outnumber the fools. That can be all of our prayer today and always. So we have this expansive view of ourselves. Most of us who are Christians know that there are many, 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 many iterations of Christian. We've got the Westboro Baptist Church that pickets funerals of servicemen and women, and they call themselves Christians. And so we know there's this whole range, but we look at Islam and we say, well, it's just this one thing, and there's no variation, and that is absolutely untrue. So we compare the best of our tradition to the worst of the other, whoever the other is. We have a very expansive vision of our own tradition and a very limited vision of the other. And finally, we compare our intentions to their actions. And frankly, this is a biggie in marriage, too. You know? Back up and go over that again. We compare we compare our intentions to the other's actions. So we say, again, saying as Christians or Jews, we say, well, you know, we just want to help people and spread the love of God and make the world better for everyone. And those other guys, they just want to get territory and get power and wipe all of us out. And that's not true. It's not true. And frankly, sometimes our actions do not live up to our intentions either. Often they don't. No human being, no country, no community. We all have the best of intentions, and we don't live up to them. So you can't compare your intentions to another person's actions. And finally, we tend to see our own group as something that grows and evolves and changes and matures, and once we've made a conclusion about the other group, we tend to keep them in that peg, in that hole for forever. We don't evolve in our thinking about others the same way we evolve about ourselves. And this is a sort of a fun example, but I see this a lot in traveling. You know, you'll hear someone say, I went to Mexico on my honeymoon in 1983, and that taxi driver ripped us off, and I have never been back. Well, probably there's more to say about that than that.
They've been to New York City?
They've been to New York City, where they're also very kind and good people. I went to seminary there. Come on now. So, I want to say before I close my remarks that I am concluding my ministry at First Community Church the end of this year. It has been a marvelous experience, and we leave each other with nothing but positive feelings, and my goal and my intent is to do this kind of work, to really pursue my passion and talk as much as I can about interfaith bridge building in as many places as I can. So that is my agenda after the first of the year, and if you want to invite me, because that's what I hope to give my time and my energy to. I feel so passionately about it. It's my belief that the perspectives of religion are a bit like people standing in all different rooms of a house looking out the window. Now again, if you are a non-religious person, I would put you in this group looking out the window too. You're looking at a broad variety of the world, whereas those of us who are religious people are looking at God as we look out this window. But because we're looking out of different windows, we have different views. We would describe what we see and what we believe differently, but we're still looking at the same God. You could say the same true right out here. If you look out this window, you're going to see something very different than those of you in the back turning around. You're looking at the same river, but your view is different, and you may draw different opinions about it. That is the work of faith. You know, diversity is how creation survives. Diversity is healthy. The great potato famine of Ireland happened because they had eliminated all diversity in the crop. It didn't happen in other countries because there were more diverse crops. Diversity is something that makes us healthy and makes us community. And so my encouragement to you is that you embrace the different view, you seek to understand it better, and you let it shine on your own beliefs and let you investigate what you believe. I stand more solidly in my shoes as a Christian minister after my multi-faith work than I did before. I am enriched by the other perspectives and ways of learning that I've been exposed to, and I understand my own convictions much better. Oh, I see a body lurking, so I think I'm done. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lindsay. Join us again next week. We will be having Jaron Terry from the Central Ohio Public Relations Society of America, and the discussion will be on making the business case for LGBTQ inclusion. And we're